Beautiful.
One more question. Do you want questions in between or at the end?
Oh, rather in between, I guess, because, you know, a talk is no use when no one is understanding it, I think.
That makes a lot of sense. And
yeah, I don't know how energetic folks are right after lunch, so probably you are tired.
Well, we're all fresh. We just came here.
That's the spirit. Yeah, that's the spirit.
Yeah,
okay,
we
so
will monitor the chat as well and let you know if there's any questions from the room.
Yeah. Yes, I appreciate that. No, like really, no, this is, I don't want this to be like a formal thing because I'm not an expert on language models at all. So please, let's be interactive and try and make sense of what I'm saying. Anyway, let's rather get started. I think I brought a bit of a little Füllhorn of a series of studies that are loosely connected from the past years, and I chose the studies in the presentation really more to sorry, I can't see my mouse. That is to give the students of the summer school, you guys, some inspiration really for thinking about all this. Yeah, I know that statistical modeling and in particular language modeling, natural language processing is really a big thing at the moment, and you probably want to have that in your toolkit. However, I think a lot can go wrong with simply just taking the models that are fancy or like hip at the moment and applying them in an uncritical manner. And I think I just want to make the point with the studies that I'm talking about today that the epistemological value, so what you actually find out when you do things like that, can be very limited. Yeah, that's, I think, the main take-home message. And probably, hopefully, if you obey some of the caveats that I'm speaking about, then the epistemological value will be a bit larger, optimally, ideally. You know, no guarantee. Yeah. Let's roll. So why would you use language models to start with? The first reason this all came around was people worrying about limited statistical power, really. Yeah. So cognitive neuroscientists, and in particular people working on language, they've been using factorial designs for 40, maybe 45 years in EEG studies, and then the first MRI work came out in the late 80s, early 90s. And people were at some point acknowledging that these designs can be rather limited in statistical power simply because speech is something that is slow and it takes a lot of time. When you run an experiment, you're presenting sentences, and every sentence has one word that you're interested in, you're in trouble because you end up with, say, 40 clean trials, maybe less, when you run the standard EEG study within the ethical limitations of human neuroscience, which is probably somewhere below an hour of stimulation. Yeah. And so continuous stimulation of just, you know, a narrative, a story, something like that has the advantage that it can solve that problem for you. You can stimulate 20 minutes and still end up with 1,000 data points. So that's beautiful, of course. However, that requires that you know that what's happening during each of these data points, and you can only achieve that usually when you do some sort of computational language modeling, or at least theoretically inspired language modeling. Another reason for liking language models, and I think that's become more and more clear with the rise of predictive coding, for instance, in functional neuroimaging and in systems neuroscience, is I wouldn't say it's an accepted fact, but there's a lot of evidence for the idea that some cognitive processes are not really categorical. So it's not like on, off, or like word, not a word, or a well-formed sentence, not a well-formed sentence, but it's rather a graded thing. Yeah. And so a language model has the big advantage that that it captures that. You don't need binary binary annotations or design matrices in order to model the data when you have naturalistic designs and language models. Another thing that people like, if you think about predictive coding, for instance, is that language models can potentially increase the cognitive scientific adequacy of your experiment, right? I mean, when you come with a strong theoretical, say, linguistic background, where your model says something is present or something is absent, you know, it's a theoretical notion, has a long history, comes from the humanities, and that's probably when you talk to a cognitive psychologist, comes from memory research, for instance, that's probably weird to think, right? Where they would say, oh yeah, your span can vary and blah, 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 things like that. So things are much more gradual there. And your language model gives you a chance to probably connect the two worlds, the theoretical world and the processing world a little better. And I've already mentioned this, of course, the same or even reduced acquisition time. And that's important for economy. So when you're running a lab, you always want to save money, and an hour of testing costs more money than half an hour of testing. And then think about clinical environments where you have, say, a patient who has limited attention, or you have a patient who has a psychological disorder or something like that. And it's not ethical to keep them in the lab for too long. So you want to have short acquisition time. And then finally, what's always been a problem with factorial designs, say you have a 2x2 design and you got 30 trials for each condition and you're interested in a 2x2 interaction, right? You have a small amount of trials left, a small number of trials left that can really support your interaction statistically. And that's a bad thing, right? People have been reporting weak interactions all around, and then they don't know what to make out of it. And sometimes they make claims out of it, and it's never reported, and it's just a result of bad SNR. And now with naturalistic designs, you're a bit on the safe side there just because you have so many data points. Yeah. So that's all the benefits of this. Yeah, I'm not saying that this is the non plus ultra in every particular study. You know, there can be good reasons for using certain factorial designs. You know, say you have an MMN design or classical N400 design with a clearly circumscribed search space, etc. You know which electrode your result is appearing with, etc. So why would you use a naturalistic stimulation if you use the design for a particular purpose? So you have a clinical setup where you just want to contrast two groups. So who cares about the fancy modeling? Yeah. So don't get me wrong, I'm a fan of language modeling, but I'm just treating it as one method amongst many. And there's good reasons for using factorial designs in many circumstances.
Lars?
Yeah.
I think there was a question in the chat.
Oh, I'm sorry, I don't see the chat. Yeah, okay, let's go. Hi, everyone. Feel free to post questions. I don't understand third and fourth point. Isn't language binary? Yeah, good question. Haha, very good question. So think about, I spread my bread with, how does the sentence continue?
Butter.
Yeah, any other intuitions?
Can you repeat?
Nutella.
Nutella. I spread my bread with?
Okay. Butter.
Yeah, butter. I had two butters. Yeah. Cream, Nutella, whatever.
But I'm not understanding the point you're trying to make.
Okay, then listen. Now we got a chance of butter, and the chance is what? 2 out of 4 or 2 out of 3, something like that. So you're predicting the next word, right? You did that intuitively. Now, did you do that? Did it have to be that word or the other word? No. There was a certain chance for butter occurring, right? And there was a certain chance for another word occurring, Nutella. So that's a probabilistic thing, right? And there's a lot of evidence that your processing is probabilistic. So there's a certain chance of a word occurring. And if it occurs, and it had a high chance, then processing load can be very low. Easy, you predicted it. And if it's a word that you didn't expect, then processing demand can be relatively high. Yeah, but that really depends on the probability. So that's not a binary decision. It's a chance for, say, 100 different words. They could all occur in the same context, but the probability for them to occur is it's a graded matter. Yeah. And that's a situation where processing is not categorical, but it's graded, it's probabilistic. Yeah.
Okay, I understand. Thank you.
Okay, that's great. There's other examples also from syntactic processing where things like that happen as well. When you think about like what part of speech will come up next. Yeah, could be, say I start a sentence with the. What will happen? Will it be a noun or will it be an adjective or even an adverb? The very beautiful car. Very is probably of a less probability than the car, which is a noun, right? You get the idea. Okay, cool. How to use the models. And that's kind of the old school perspective. I know that people are probably having different perspectives on this today, but this is like the old school perspective written in papers such as David Purple's 2012 paper and John Hale's more recent report on complexity metrics. Our goal as cognitive neuroscientists is linking neurobiology to cognition, right? That's my goal. I don't know. If you're interested in language or interested well, yes, cognition, any other aspect of cognition, and you're working in neuroscience or you're using an EEG or whatever, then your goal is essentially trying to find neurobiology that fits certain boxes and arrows in your models. Yeah. Now, how do you do that? You want to explain this link, and can you do that right away? Can you just say, hey, I'll take this naturalistic stimulus of mine, this story, and I just take cognition and I use it in a regression model and make a statistical analysis that links directly cognition to neurobiology? Can you link a box on a sheet of paper to, say, a microvolts in an EEG? No, right? Doesn't work. You need a number. Yeah. So you start with your this controls. You start with cognition, right? Here you start with a processing theory. Could come from linguistics, could come from cognitive science. And that's kind of the qualitative side of things. That's what a human can understand. As a theory, it is built from some psychological, cognitive scientific claim about the ontological structure of a domain. What boxes are in our mind? That's what cognitive science is all about, right? And this should, of course, be well motivated, whatever that means. You should speak to your colleagues and ask what the most recent model is and what the most important boxes are when you want to get this process started. You need to know what you want to investigate, and you need to know whether it's parsimonious to really investigate it, or whether it's just something that you came up with intuitively. Yeah. And then I'll just put them all here. Maybe I should have started with the third one. Please look at the third one first. On the other end, there's a measurement. You're in the lab and you record some signal, neural signal. And that neural signal should be sensitive to the cognitive process that you're studying. That's also something to consider, right? So when you say you're acquiring bold MRI, or you're acquiring diffusion weighted images or something, right? And then you try to regress it against like some model of language comprehension. It's probably not particularly meaningful, right? So the neural signal should be sensitive to the cognitive process that you are studying. And ideally, something that depends on your taste, really. It depends on how far you want to go. But I think an ideal cognitive neuroscientific study would use a neural signal that is biologically realistic in terms of cognition. Yeah. When you think about how cognition is really operationalized in a brain, it's probably something like, I don't know, a change in membrane potential, or a potential in general, something like that. Yeah. When you have something like, say, bold MRI, like, is it meaningfully related? Yes, but it's indirect, right? So these are the things that you have to consider, right? And ideally, you would have a measure where you can say, hey, this makes sense to match my cognitive process with. And then to connect the two, and that's already what I mentioned, because you cannot just say when you're a linguist, a syntax tree, cannot just link it to your neuroscientific measurement. It doesn't work, right? The tree is qualitative. It is in a different code, yeah. And so you first need some shared code between the measurement and your theory, and that's a number. You need a number. Then you can use numbers in regression modeling, for instance, right? And we call those numbers a linking hypothesis, a number that quantifies how difficult a specified cognitive process is, or how much neural labor it involves. So that's where the two sides meet. You see, you say difficulty means a lot of brain signal. That's the general idea, right? And now you're both sentences are articulated in terms of something that you can quantify. Yeah. So you take your processing theory, you find a way to carve it into numbers, and then you can statistically link those to your measurement. That's what you need to do. Yeah. And there's a trend currently, and we discuss it later, to not care so much about the topmost box here, and to just say, hey, I take my numbers that my Python model spits out, and I'll regress to them at against the brain data, and I will expect that the result is meaningful. And that can be true, yeah, if you understand how those numbers come out. But when you just take those numbers for granted and you don't know what's really in that fancy new NLP model that you downloaded, then you're in trouble, because then there's no way back to cognition. You just have a linking hypothesis and a measurement. No. And I will try in the examples today to kind of speak to all three boxes, okay? And that's also why I selected the studies that I'm presenting today. Because in those studies, we kind of hope that we got full circle, covering this whole relationship between processing theory, measurement, and the linking hypothesis that joins them too. So I don't make language models myself, so please don't ask detailed questions. Halfway joking, but it's true. So I'm more, like I mentioned already, I'm an occasional user in cases where the statistical epistemic advantages of language models are valuable, say limited acquisition time or something like that, or a research question that needs a continuous stimulus because I'm interested in fluctuations over time or something like that, right? But it really depends on the research question that you're asking. So I will just give a couple of examples of applications and illustrate the potential and caveats within the trialectic description of processing theory, linking hypothesis, and measurement. And the first bit of studies that I will be talking about comes from a process called chunking. So that's a part of cognition that I'm interested in. And we used a superficial form of language modeling there to define chunking. And the second part that I will be talking about is dependency formation. How many people in the room are familiar with language? Can you raise your hand, please, so I get a rough idea? Yeah, I can see a couple of hands. How many people know what a dependency is? Yeah, I even have thumbs up in the chat and people, okay, perfect, good. I will also speak a bit about dependency formation, possible models. And then if we have time, there will be bonus content from a bad example. So I'm guilty of bad scientific practice, and I will try and find the time to tell you about it, okay? So chunking, why chunking? Speech is something that is in time, right? So it happens over time. Sentence is never there in an instant. It's always taking a couple of seconds. So the problem with that is that your memory is fleeting. So multiple words need to somehow be chunked, recoded into a joint memory unit in order to process them. Say you have a phrase like, the very bad coffee from the cafeteria, which is what I have in my hand. So that's multiple words. They belong together. They describe a coherent thing somehow. And you need to understand that, right, with your cognitive apparatus, right? In order to do that in the face of your memory decay and your memory interference, you need a process called chunking. I could go on for hours motivating that process, but I think that would be very boring. Perception is not continuous. That's another reason why I'm interested in chunking, but it's discrete in time. Stimuli, for instance, speech, are not really perceived as continuous stimuli, but they're perceived as sequences of discrete units. Think about words. You have a perception that there's something like a word. Although when you look at the speech stream, you don't have words. You just have like a limitless succession of acoustic amplitude fluctuations. Okay, but you still perceive this as words and like maybe smaller units like syllables or whatnot. Yeah, and that's interesting. I think your perception itself is somehow discrete. Yeah. And here, like when I'm talking about chunking, because I'm coming like from the kind of syntax camp originally, I'm interested in the macroscopic speech or processing units, such as sentences, clauses, and phrases. Yeah, and I'm just leaving you with the very simplistic notion that one of these units corresponds roughly to one thought, like the cold brown beverage in my cup, which is one coherent thought. Yeah, and it extends over time, and you could call that a chunk if you want. Linguists might call this a phrase, but it's not important. Hopefully this is well motivated. Yeah, there's reason from cognitive psychology to think that is all the case. There's reason from neurophysiology to think about discrete perception. And there's all those reasons from psycholinguistics and theoretical linguistics to claim that there's macroscopic units that are not just phonemes or syllables, but they're abstract units. Yeah. But that's a good question. You have to think about it. Is this well motivated aspect of cognition? Is chunking real? Where is it? Hamburg, Berlin, where does chunking live? I don't know. Yeah. Yeah. So make up your mind whether this is well motivating. That's all I'm saying. Yeah. The hypothesis that my students and I are after is that there's a relationship between chunking and electrophysiology. And this relationship we think has to do with what I mentioned already, that electrophysiology or neurobiology is a discrete thing, and discrete in terms of here activity that is somehow patterned, repetitive over time, okay? So when you think about electrophysiology, you see that it's just a toy model, that it runs in circles. There's one cycle here, charge, discharge, charge, discharge, charge. So it goes on like that, right? That's what if you would record this at a neuron, and on the right side, you see what you would record at a scalp, or what you would get out of your MEG or EEG when you filter the data. And we call this a neural oscillation, of course. And for me, being like someone interested in abstraction in language, coming from syntax, speaking about macroscopic units, thinking about like units of thought, probably. These are interesting because I think they give me a chance to map something in neurophysiology to something in language or in processing. Yeah. So the duration of these cycles may even last, maybe reach to up to a couple of seconds. Those have actually been described even in the cortex. And so that's something where I could say, hey, I could link those durations to actually the durations of units in speech. Yeah, I'm using a bit of NLP for that. Yeah, and now again, is this biologically plausible? Yeah, we have to wonder about this when we do this experiment. Is this like a measure that we would like from the neuroscientific point of view? I do like it. Yeah, but of course you have to make up your mind about which of these measures to use. Now, the first study that we did on this, and I'll just briefly brush over it, is comparing a condition where we're comparing where chunking is possible. That's the top one here. They were yesterday evening at the. You see how this is kind of a sentence fragment. And we compare this against the condition where we don't have any relationship between the worlds. They, the, at evening, yesterday were. So you can't chunk. And the comparison of the two conditions just gives us an increase in low frequency power here over the anterior sensors. And that's kind of the first step where we thought this is somehow we're on the right track with this hypothesis. Yeah, but this is not about like duration of units yet. This is just about how much energy do we get spectrally for this and that condition.
I'm sorry, Lars.
Yeah,
I think we have a question to the previous slide.
Yeah, okay, let's go.
Sorry for interrupting. So this is a hypothesis of how your theory is biologically feasible. When it comes to your original computational hypothesis, what criteria do you use to differentiate if it's a good hypothesis or not?
Good question. Anyone an idea? I have one, but I want to make this interactive. Okay, read a lot of papers, I think. So you have to see whether this is scientifically, whether there's something to it in terms of experiments that have been performed that can be behavioral, they can be neural, they can be whatever, that have provided evidence that there is a psychological entity that we might want to call that matches the description or the definition of, say, chunking. I think that's the criterion. As psychologists, we would want to see whether a box that someone has postulated in their model, whether there's evidence that this is actually relevant for processing. Neurally relevant, okay, there should be neurosensitivity to it, but we still need to work on that in most cases. Yeah, so I think behavioral relevance is always a good benchmark, yeah, and that means there should be studies that you trust in and that other people trust in. Yeah, that would be my answer. I don't know whether that's sufficient.
He said thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. I don't know. We could talk about epistemology now, and of course, you as psychologists, linguists know that you should never trust an authority, right? That's not what we do as scientists. We don't rely on authority. We rely on measurement, and we don't believe someone just because he's superior to us. Yeah, but of course, you will know that during your university education or PhD, you will of course have trusted certain authorities, and those are humans, and that's always dangerous, of course. But what can you do? Okay, I had this. Yeah, okay, let's talk about this study as well. I just have to watch the time. It's already 2:30. How much time do I have?
So I would say till 3 at least.
Okay, cool. That's nice. Okay, good. In a second study we did to talk to that hypothesis of a link between oscillatory cycles and chunks in language, we're using this classical paradigm that used ambiguous sentences. And you may be familiar with these. The client sued the murderer with the corrupt lawyer. Whose lawyer is this? Yeah. I once tried this in a lecture hall, and I had 50 people. No, that's not true. I had 5 and 5. It was a small lecture hall. And 5 people said it's the client's lawyer, and 5 people said it's the murderer's lawyer. And I was so happy about it. But I tried it 10 times and it worked once. But I keep on trying. Yeah. So you could do it. The good thing about language usually is, or speech, is that you would disambiguate that sentence, right? You could, for instance, speak it with a single chunk prosody, I call this. The client sued the murderer with the corrupt lawyer. And since I didn't make any breaks in between the murderer and the corrupt lawyer, this is supposed to be one chunk in your memory, right? It should be one coherent thingy. When I speak this differently, the client sued the murderer with the corrupt lawyer. You get the idea, right? And then you're supposed to split this off at this point in the sentence. So 2 different chunking patterns and it's the same sentence. Usually in actual speech, you have an acoustic stimulus that tells you what to do. It's good, yeah. But when we ask people in an experiment whose lawyer this is, and we present the sentence in both acoustic conditions, either with the one or the other prosody, we find that, yeah, they do take prosody into account. So when there is a prosodic cue at the end of the murderer that says, hey, quit the chunk, then people tend to do this. Yeah, so they are obedient, and vice versa. So when there's an acoustic cue only before the murderer, but no acoustic cue intervening between murderer and then people tend to make one long chunk. Yeah, so prosody works. Thank you, prosody. But people often ignore that prosodic cue. And that's why we are using this paradigm. Of course, we know this before, that this works for that paradigm. Yeah? So often there's the case that people, even if there's no stimulus in terms of like classical kind of conditional psychology, even there's no stimulus, people still tend to end a chunk here at the offset. And that's beautiful because we have an experiment where we don't have a stimulus, but we can still observe from the response that participants give a behavioral response. And that might be actually occurring. If it occurs without a stimulus. So there's no trigger that tells you end a chunk, but people still do it. Okay? So what is this? That is like a looking glass into cognition. Yeah, and the stimulus is out. We, of course, simple-minded as we are, we just thought we could address our toy model here of chunking and the relationship between chunking and oscillations with that paradigm. Yeah? And our hypothesis was, of course, that if people terminate a chunk here at this point in the sentence, we should be observing the end of one of these cycles. And if people are continuing the chunk, the cycle should not have reached its end yet. Very simple model. Yeah. We tested this EEG with like, I don't know, 50 subjects, and we indeed observed this difference here in the phase angle of the two oscillations between the two responses, irrespective of acoustics. Yeah. So yes, there's a relationship between those cycles, and I'll jump over this because it's very boring. Now, we think there's a relationship between like these kind of supra-word, large word bundles, chunks, phrases, whatever. But now we, of course, want to know what the nature of these units is. I'm using the word chunk all the time, but you probably haven't still not fully grasped what I mean by that. Yeah. In this behavior study, and this is now where I'm hinting at NLP and at language modeling, we're analyzing a data set of 180 subjects reading about 10 stories each. And our first goal was to detect, again, something periodic in the data at a time scale that is consistent with supra-word units. Yeah. And in this case, we were hunting for slowdowns, because that's been observed in behavioral data. When people reach the end of, say, a subordinate clause or a sentence, they slow down. So they read through the sentence word by word, and they go bop, 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 end of the sentence, and then they accelerate again, bop, 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 okay? And we then just analyzed those behavioral data again with time frequency analysis, because I wanted to see whether that neurofinding that we had would replicate in behavior, and it did. Yeah, so you do get here nicely also in behavior these periodic slowdowns. Now, when do these occur? And we are claiming chunking, right? And in order to formalize that term a bit, we are using a language model. And the language model that we're using here comes from something called Dependency Grammar. Some of you might be familiar with Dependency Parsing. It's basically a formalization of relationships amongst words. So you see here how this sentence, I am never less lonely than when I am alone. It's like the saddest example sentence that I ever saw. It comes from a collaborator, and he sent it. I think it's hilarious, but it's a good example. So you get these dependency annotations from a dependency parser. So that's an algorithm that can, based on a big annotated corpus, give you these structures basically, and it's like a hierarchy-free grammar. Where it just annotates the relationships amongst words. And then we define a chunk, and that's been done by linguistic theory. So for by theoretical linguistics folks who are working on the interception of perceptual chunking and grammatical theory, we define it as something that closes all the local dependencies. You see here, like all the short arrows locally, they find their targets, right? In the first chunk. And then there's one long distance dependency. So the chunk ends here, and then there's another chunk, local dependencies, and so on and so forth. And then here, local dependencies again, and the long distance dependencies spanning it all. Chunk, chunk, chunk. That's our formalism. And we chose this simply because it has little theory in it, and it gives us maximum coverage also cross-linguistically. So we're also running studies here on multiple languages. And the good thing about this type of grammar and this type of definition of chunk is that it can be used for any language for which you get a dependency annotation. And I want something that is general when I want to understand the neurobiology of language. Now, we are then asking our model. So we get this here for our entire 180 subjects, 10 stories. And we're then just asking our model or language model of chunking whether participants would show these slowdowns that we observed at the boundaries of these chunks. And that's the case. I was super surprised and happy about it. We reanalyzed it 10 times because the model changed, and at first the model was somehow having bugs, and we had to debug it, and then we debugged it again and again. I start to be happy with the model, but it might still change. The cool thing is that this difference between the no boundary, so that's just any word, and this here is the boundary, so when a chunk ends, this has always been significant. So this means that whenever you reach one of these boundaries that is predicted by a language model, essentially, so the language model in an unsupervised fashion tells us this is the boundary of a chunk. And we just defined what a chunk is. It predicts a slowdown of subjects. So every time they reach the end of one of these, of course, they also slow down at the end of a sentence. We knew this before, but the chunk effect was kind of new. And here you just see it in a different manner. Look at the clock. Okay, still some time to go. Okay, chunking. Now I'm happy and I say, hey, one of these electrophysiological cycles is probably corresponding to one memory chunk, and that's probably on the linguistic side of things. A chunk is something like this locally finished dependency bundle. So I have kind of, in my view, drawn a link between our theory.
Lars? Sorry, there was a question from the audience.
Go ahead.
Hi. Yeah, it was just like in the last slide. So is the hypothesis that that slowdown happens because you're waiting for a cycle to finish? So like each cycle corresponds to a chunk, and then you wait for the cycle to finish to go to the next chunk, or is it something else you had in mind?
Oh, that's a very, very nice question. Very nice question. I think, but I cannot prove it, that those cycles are in fact something like pacemakers. So, and that's also consistent with the EEG result that we had. So when you reach the end of your electrophysiological window, window, then you cannot eat any more words. They don't fit anymore, right? So you have to end. And so in reading, because this is all reading, this would mean that people are somehow aware of how much time they have left, and they would try to cram all the words that they can still fit into this window. Yeah, and so they would go like, chick, 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 gotta hurry, okay. And so that slowdown for me would be, I don't know. People have called this recoding, but I don't know what it means. Yeah, they say you have to recode the single words into some higher level representation. But what that means, I don't know. It's unclear to me. Yeah? These are just words, and I don't know what a representation is, and I don't know what recoding means. So that's really, that would be the answer. I think people need some time to recode the words into a higher level memory representation, but I cannot explain what that means.
But did you match the EEG recordings with the kind of reaction times or something?
Ah, that's a good question. It's a different data set. So here in the EEG, there's only a behavioral task after the sentence. Because when you want to do this analysis, you need clean data. And with the button press, you destroy the clean data, because it triggers a large motor evoked potential. So you cannot then analyze the slow frequency data anymore. So we have to keep the EEG data clean of the response. In self-paced reading, you get a response for each word. Whether this is corresponding to actually the end of an electrophysiological cycle, I don't know. Yeah, we have a separate data set that's under review at the moment, where we have eye tracking and EEG in parallel. And there we find the same, well, it's not the same, it's a different effect because it's electrophysiological data. There we find a consistent angle of the slow frequency oscillation also at the end of these units. Yeah, so that's in those data, yes. Yeah, so you get a slowdown in the eye tracking, and that's correlated then with the consistent phase in the EEG. Yeah, but a direct link between like behavioral responses and this kind of reaction time slowdown in EEG, I don't have it yet.
Can I have a following question?
Of course.
Yeah, I mean, since you say the sentence speed is slowing down in the end of a chunk, and then also the processing is also slowed down. How do you tell this is really the end of a chunk make the EEG slow down, or this is because you have less information since everything is slowed down, so you don't have to process less fast?
Yeah, I know what you mean, but that effect is in psycholinguistics rather a speed up towards the end of the sentence. So when people have less information, they just go boop, 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 because everything is expected. So that's kind of, we also correct, I think, statistically for that effect. So when you fit like a regression towards the sentence ending, and we put that into the statistical model. So this is like an MLE and it's hierarchical. So you have the sentence overall and the position of the word in the sentence, and then on top you have the chunk boundary. Yeah.
I see. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Okay, let's see. I think I would rather like to speak a bit about dependencies because this here is, maybe I do talk about it. Okay, I'll try to make it quick, sorry. That's the toy model, right? You have one cycle, you have one chunk, and now what? Why do you have that cycle, and what is it good for? In animal electrophysiology, and there's also some like human data, the point in this cycle, the relative time point in the sine wave has a meaning. And the meaning is actually related to information processing on the cellular level. What this means is excitability of the neuron. When the membrane potential is high, you can't excite the cell. It's about to fire, so it doesn't want any new information. It wants to talk to someone else. It doesn't want to listen anymore. Whereas when the membrane potential is down here, the cell is excitable. It's when it likes to receive information. Okay, that's the meaning. It's kind of the microstructure of these cycles. Yeah, and so I'm wondering, or back then here in 2017, Matthias and I were wondering whether there's any relationship between those the excitability indicated by that measure from the EEG and the substructure of the chunk. And again, in order to find out about this, we've been using a language model. And our language model was based on a probabilistic context-free grammar. So that's essentially it's a version of government and binding for beginners. And we're quantifying the labor within those trees using a complexity metric called surprise. I will explain this in a minute. Consider these here. And I already mentioned something similar to that. When you have the green version here, you find that a noun is very unsurprising after determiner, right? The cat. Okay, noun after determiner. I can do that. When you have an adjective instead, that's according to corpus data, it's less frequent. Yeah, less probable to occur. You're expecting it less strongly based on your internal knowledge, language model, whatever. And then finally, if there's an adverb coming up with very, then this is probably even more demanding, just simply because it's less expected. And it's less expected based on your grammatical knowledge, because that's categorical in this case, determiner, adjective, noun. And there's a certain probability for each of the categories to occur, right? And that's our labor that we wanted to assess. We wanted to see whether that excitability gradient in the EEG is somehow relevant for processing that type of information. And so we're calculating again with the probabilistic context-free grammar. There's like this hierarchical, you can see here, it's a bracket annotation because the slide was too small. You see how it's hierarchical here, yeah? And you have a hierarchical structure. Here, there's an embedded bracket and so on and so forth. And we do that for the entire tiger tree bank, which is annotated in that fashion. It's a hierarchical grammar, not dependency grammar. And that gives us the ability to also annotate the stimuli in our study based on that. So we can parse them essentially. And for each of the words, calculate how expected the word class is. So we can quantify the amount of information that each word is bringing to the sentence, and thereby make a prediction on the syntactic labor that you need to do. Yeah. In information theory, you just call this information content, and we use often the quantity called surpriser, but that's just another word for this. Information content means here something that you didn't expect. If there's a part of speech coming in that you didn't expect, it's surprising. Yeah? It's improbable, and so it's information to you. That's what Shannon defined information like. Yeah? And so we make this paradigm where we have a chunk, die ziemlich berühmte Künstlerin, the somewhat famous artist. It's like a bee starlet, yeah? A somewhat famous artist. And now we calculate surprisal information content at each point in this chunk, because we're interested in the gradient, right? So we need the time resolution. And then we place little errors in the phrase or in the chunk at 10 different positions. It was the master's thesis, and the student, well, he still speaks to me, but I don't know, he wasn't super happy with all that work, but you know, he succeeded. It was a complex study, but yeah. And so we hypothesized simply that if there's something about excitability and the EEG and relates to syntax or like to this type of information that we would like to decode from the stimulus, because that's what our brain is all about, right? It wants to read what this kind of sentence means. Then we should see first an optimal detection performance for those errors, depending on how surprising or unsurprising the context is. So our language model here can predict behavior. That's good for cognitive science. But then we also wanted to know whether there's a relationship, or that's the hypothesis we had, that there's a relationship between this violation detection performance and the phase gradient of this low frequency oscillation. Because again, we've claimed already there's a relationship between those chunks and the slow frequency cycles, we know that the cycle is excitability. And so excitability predicts that the performance fluctuates across the chunk, right? And so we test this. That's just the behavior, the paradigm works, surprisal predicts behavioral performance. Perfect. We knew that from previous studies. That's just proof of principle. Yeah, that's just saying the language model can reliably predict the performance on this error detection task. Yeah, if that doesn't work, then I don't know whether my construct is behaviorally or cognitively relevant. Yeah, I think you always have to do everything: behavior, neurobiology, and cognitive science, or like modeling in this case. Yeah, but this is more interesting. On the left, you see the progression of the slow frequency phase across the chunk. And you see from the little blue arrow that this phase is changing across the positions. You see here the angle? Here it's a different one, right? And it progresses slowly across the thingy. And that's correlated with the reaction time in the behavioral task. And it's correlated with the violation position. Yeah, you see here, that's kind of sorting the trials by oscillatory phase. It's a bit complex, but this just means you should see a sine wave and you kind of get up, down, up. And here again, down, up, down. Yeah, and this hints at least at a relationship between the phase that you are in during this chunk and your ability to process the information within that chunk. It's like you're aligning with the large unit, and now you have like this progression of, oh yeah, good stuff, yeah, okay, bad stuff, okay, interesting, not interesting, something like that. Yeah, I don't know much more than that, but I think this is interesting. Okay, and that is a use case, of course, of a language model again, right? Because we're quantifying the surprisal. Now we're quantifying the information that you're reading here from the chunk through this model. That's our language model. Yeah? So we say this is how our sentence structure is built. We have this hierarchical structure in there, and we're quantifying the probability of parts of speech to occur based on the annotated corpus. Yeah? And then we regress this against the EEG. Whether this is meaningful, I have to ask the linguists whether this is a good theory to start with. Yeah, many people think so. I'm skeptical. Okay, chunking, talked about this enough. We got 10 minutes left. I'll speak a bit about dependency processing and working memory. So dependency formation is something that is apparently costly. And that comes, I like this quote from Mark Twain. It's a funny book anyway. So an average sentence in a German newspaper treats of 15 different subjects between king parentheses, one in the first line of the majestic sentence and the other one in the last line of it, after which comes the verb. And you find out for the first time what the man has been talking about. Then the reader is in a very exhausted state. So dependency processing is taxing. That's all that Mark Twain wants to say in these 5 lines. And German is a bad language because we have these long dependencies. Okay? Memory intensive. Is this well motivated? Not if Mr. Twain says so, but there's a lot of evidence from behavioral work, and also, you know, it dates back 40 years, I think, that dependencies are memory intensive. You have these, for instance, here in argument verb dependencies, when you have a subject and the main verb here. You have it in verbs and particles, like here in this study, spiegelt vor is the particle verb dependency, anaphora, the pianist, he, co-reference. And this is just one of my favorite studies on this, because they have, Factorial and colleagues have shown that cross-linguistically languages strive for short dependencies, presumably because these are, the long ones are memory intensive. So in the first study that we did on this, and this is not modeling yet, we were just taking inspiration from domains outside of language on a functional relevance of alpha band oscillations for memory. general working memory, so you have a Sternberg task, you're supposed to remember a couple numbers, you will get an increase in alpha band power. Yeah, and so that's been related to memory, functional inhibition. So there's a link between working memory and cellular activity, if you so will. And in this study, we're just thinking that, hey, this should also work for dependencies. Long dependency, short dependency. Short dependency, subject verb. Long dependency, subject verb. Contrasting these two, and we see that here immediately before the verb, it actually continues across the sentence. The alpha band power is increasing. So that if you're not familiar with this plot, on the x-axis it's time, on the y-axis it's frequency, and on the z, so the rainbow, that's the power of the oscillation, oscillations. That just tells you how much brain activity is present at this particular frequency, at this point in the sentence. Yeah, so alpha increases, check, for the long dependency. Classical alpha band topography, so nothing controversial about that. And this is just the source localization. So you see here left parietal generators of that effect, and also bilateral occipital regions being active. Now the link to memory is strengthened, I think, by a correlation that we found between the alpha band activity here in the left parietal cortex and the memory span of subjects. So people with a high span don't need to ramp up their alpha that much. And that's also something that people have reported. Yeah, so that's just the first study we did. And then again, okay, biologically plausible, please, I'm happy with this because alpha has a functional interpretation, biological interpretation. It's related to inhibition on the cellular level, but we can also now link it to our construct, yeah, to memory, based on a factorial comparison, okay? But we can also do this with a language model. And again, our language model is using dependencies, dependency parsing, yeah, where we know, okay, long dependencies are costly. And so this annotation that our language model gives us, that comes from dependency annotation, and of course has theoretical implications, etc., predicts how much memory load there is. Yeah, and so we should be able to use this and see whether there's brain activity that is parametrically modulated, and again, parametrically, because we can count the number of these dependencies. And we would think that if there's multiple dependencies, the memory labor should even increase. Like, look at this point in the sentence, we have 4 dependencies in parallel. And if that doesn't drive alpha, then I don't know. Then my previous study is just wrong. Yeah, it can't be true then. And so we are using dependency parsing again. Train a dependency parser again on a tree bank. I think this is English now. Provide a dependency structure for the entire text. Naturalistic stimulation now, not a single dependency, but 100 or so, maybe 1,000 across the entire text. And so we get an estimate here of the memory storage demand over time. That's the number that we get. It's our linking hypothesis, if you so will. Yeah, and then we just regress this. And again, we get an alpha power increase. Every time there's this blue type of dependency, this is argument verb, the alpha band power increases. And this is now again a language model of dependency processing. It comes from originally some type of linguistic theory that says, hey, words depend on each other. They form relationships. Yeah? Most grammars, whether functionalists or like formalists, they have this type of idea. And we take that, we make a linking hypothesis based on some parser, and it spits us numbers. The simple version is just the number of dependencies, but that's a linking hypothesis. You say 1 means 1 memory, 2 means 2 memory, 3 means 3 memory. 3 memory equals 3 dependencies. Okay, and so we get the same. I think that's a replication here, increase in alpha band power. Let's see, language model meets cognitive models. Ach yeah, that's another thing I would like to say. So if you're from cognitive science and you're like an expert on on dependency parsing, and there's of course many things you can try. You can even use that type of approach to dissociate different processing theories. Yeah. So there's very articulate models in the working memory literature or psycholinguistic working memory literature on dependency processing, on how this actually works, what you in fact do precisely. So they wouldn't just say, hey, one dependency equals one. They would say something like, oh yes, but there's interference, and the distance of the dependency has something to say about the labor, you know, and the question on whether there's multiple dependencies of the same type has something to say about it, and then the prediction has something to say about it, etc. Right? You can like go into infinite complexity there, right? But I cannot crack all problems at the same time. So I'm good with the ones and twos and threes from the model that we had. Probably in the future we can make this a bit more sophisticated. Okay, this is just that's the bad example. Should I continue with the bad example?
Yes.
I have one year. Okay, I'll continue. This is one bad example, and yeah, we used like it's not the newest anymore, right? I think there's newer, fancier language models, but we were bored in COVID, and we had some time to kill, and we thought we'd also try this new fancy model called GPT-2. And that's again what we are using here to quantify the cognitive labor, right? GPT-2 somehow, what does it do again? I think it predicts words. That's what it is good at, predicting upcoming words from prior words. I put on my bread butter. And GPT-2 is very good in predicting the same word that you would predict. Yeah, you like butter. GPT-2 likes butter too. So that's the model we use, and it again calculates for us a linking theory called surprisal that gives us the probability of each word in a text to occur. Yeah, so it's an entire stimulus, a whole entire story, and we get a number for each word, and that number quantifies how probable the word is to occur given what GPT-2 predicts. That's what this number means. Yeah, and so we get that number for each word in a sentence on the whole story. And in this experiment, and that's also why we were sloppy on the modeling, we were interested in whether the gesture that accompanies the story would somehow modulate how the electrophysiology is able to deal with the labor, with the complexity, with the surprise. Yeah, so we had a condition where there were gestures present. So it's like this person on the screen and saying, "So mir bleibt 3 Tage," and then there's a gesture. Yeah? And that's kind of, we were interested in whether that gesture would help you predict an upcoming word. And we do that using EEG again. And to quantify whether it helps you predict the word, we're using a well-known ERP called the N400, which is an evoked component that is related to lexical semantic prediction error. Here, gesture present, that's the red condition, so there is a gesture. And blue is gesture absent, when you don't have a gesture. Yeah? And this difference here in the N400 time window is in fact significant. Yeah? So this means that the N400 is smaller when you have a gesture. Yeah? And we get that N400 by regressing GPT-2's predictions against the EEG. That's great. Is it? I don't know, because I don't know what it means. Do you know what it means? I don't know. Probably it means that somehow, well, predicting the next word is easier when you have a gesture. That's an inference that we can draw. It's easier when you, do you need EEG for that? Do you need anything for that? Do you need GPT-2 for that? I don't know. Do we understand how the brain came to this result? Why is that easier to predict the next word? No, we don't. And the reason for that is that we don't know how this kind of complexity metric, how that number that GPT-2 gave to us is really resulting, how it comes about. Yeah, just gives us a number and we think, oh yeah, that's the probability of the next word. But that doesn't tell us how our own brain has predicted the next word, gesture or not. But this analysis is deaf to how actually the process worked, right? So in terms of cognitive science, it doesn't bias much. It just tells us that the N for 100 gets smaller when we have a gesture. And that's about it. And, you know, in order to like have more knowledge from this, we would have to dig into the details of that language model. But the language model has a couple of billion parameters, so it's very hard to understand, I think. And I think there's now neuroscientists who try to understand those models instead of understanding neurobiology, yeah, simply because they arrive at the same tricky moment, I think. Sorry?
So I got a question. I got a question to your point.
Yeah.
So you said that these language models don't really explain anything. Right? It doesn't really give us an explanation.
Yeah, I think
like,
so.
Is like to me, it still gives me some kind of explanation in terms of that neural networks, like this architecture might be valid in how we do these things. So I wouldn't say it doesn't give us anything just because it has a lot of parameters, but it would give us something in terms of this architecture is valid, right?
I don't know. I disagree. I think it's like it produces the same. Say you have like a Turing machine, the perfect Turing machine, like a robot. It has cogwheels and wires, and it has lights, and it has a mouth, and it predicts always the right word. Always. It's perfect in doing that. And now you're taking that number that this model produces, and you regress it against the brain data, and you find that it fits the brain data.
But isn't a Turing machine different to what GPT-2 does?
Why?
Because it's more inspired by the brain.
In which way?
That we do neural networks, and these are inspired by neurons in the brain. Isn't that kind of different? I'm not sure if I get your point that it doesn't really explain how, but I also intuitively think that it gives us something, at least something.
I think my point is that there was no knowledge from cognitive psychology and on neuroscience that really entered. I mean, saying a neural network just means I have two nodes and they're connected by some kind of probability, and then the probability changes from the training data. And I do that with many, many nodes. Is that a brain? I mean, that's really, I don't know. I don't know the answer. I know your point, and I totally understand what you mean. I don't know how that, or whether that really qualifies as this works like a brain. I don't know. A brain doesn't have the same transitional probabilities everywhere, because there's white matter and gray matter, there's different layers. They have different conduction velocities, there's myelin, there's different Brodmann areas, and they all have different wiring patterns. Some patches of cortex have a certain layer, some don't. It's, you know, there's like different nuclei, and they have different cell types, and they don't have the same transitional probabilities all over. Yeah? So I would be happy if one day someone finds, hey, I got my layers 10,000 to 40,000, and they correlate with the thalamus, and the other layers, they correlate with this and that type of cortical patch, and that's because the cells in that patch are wired in the same way. Yeah, that would be the goal. I agree. Yeah, and that's I think a possible. How should I say? That's a possible research direction. Yeah. I'm just saying. I'm saying there's nothing wrong with that. I'm just saying if you want to use the model for explanation, then you have to do that. Then you have to understand which part of the algorithm, you know, corresponds to which part of our machinery. Yeah. That's what I mean. So if you have like a machine that has the same parts and they are wired in the same manner, then that's a brain. And then that's a super cool model. I don't know whether it's even a model then, or whether it's just a brain.
Okay, thank you. I think.
But that's a strong, and that's exactly the question that you have to wonder about when you're using highly complex models, I think. Yeah. And kind of, yeah, I wanted to have a slide with like a description of like an even superficial description of a transformer, a description of how it works. I think in theory, you can kind of explain it through like a couple of boxes, and it's kind of a more advanced network that has kind of self-aware long distance prediction or something like that. And that's why it's better than previous models. Yeah. And there might be a link between that and things like dependency processing. That's what people, that's I think what people originally like Dan Jarofsky and those folks, that's what they I think originally envisioned probabilistic language models to work like. Yeah. So possible, yes. Yeah. For me, it's just, I don't know, trying to understand how a model works is, and you use the model and then afterwards you try to understand what it actually does. And that's, I think, one should at least know what it's doing in order to decide what it explains to us, like in this case for the N400. I think that's the one word of caution. There's nothing wrong with using fancy models, but using them without actually understanding how they work, I think that just limits the explanative content. Here it was about gesture processing, and probably I think in the paper draft, it's all about gestures and they facilitate lexical semantic processing. But lexical semantic processing is there just a chiffre. And when someone would ask, oh yeah, what do you mean by that? I would go like, oh shit. No.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for the question. That's exactly the question that I was hoping for.
So you called this talk epistemological considerations, but
Yeah.
it really seems like a critique to me, since you're mostly critiquing like a certain development in cognitive science where models are, we don't even know what the models do. We just want them to predict stuff. So it seems like a critique. But do you have any like considerations of, besides the things you've just named, with it being more on the implementational level and more information from neurons? Do you have any considerations for how we can actually do it better?
Yes. That's also, I don't know. I can just, my answer would be, I'm afraid, as a scientist, I'm afraid of anything that I cannot understand. It makes me super nervous. And I know that's been, and that's probably across the history of psychology, it's been a lot of criticism of using concepts like memory or attention or word, or like dependency, simply because the origin of many of these terms is of descriptive nature, right? And that's like, for entire linguistics, it's probably true. We assume that there exists something like a word in our mind. And that's, of course, I mean, why should it? Why should our mind have a word in it? Why should it care about words? Simply because we think they're like a syllable or something like that. Yeah. And there's heated discussions on all of that. But we do want something that we can understand, right? We do want, when we're running a study, we want to make sense of cognition. We need to use those words, and in order to like, I think, to understand it, we need them. And I think that's a reason for clinging to those established constructs and for trying to, well, keep them, or like trying to use them as searchlights still. But I do agree, that's kind of the reverse problem. Yeah. There you're assuming tons of things. And for me, that's kind of, I'm guilty of this in the presentation, like this, this one here, PCFGs, like the theoretical postulate is just so heavy. And most people in psycholinguistics would by now disagree that this is how sentence processing works, right? They would rather think about, oh yeah, probably we do rather this type of thing. Yeah. So it comes with a choice, and the question came up earlier, like what makes for a well-motivated construct, and that's just as tough as well. You're right. Yeah. Is a goal of cognitive science also to be human understandable?
I think that should be the only goal, right?
I don't know. I don't know. Maybe we also have to arrive at models that don't make any sense to us, because the part of our cognition that is visible to ourselves, right, our understanding and our awareness might be structured completely differently from the actual machinery inside of us, right? That's what I mean. Just because I am so sure that a word exists and a word is so clear, it's such a clear concept to me, or memory, such a clear concept to me, doesn't mean that it actually has a counterpart. Yeah? And that's the danger of working with strong theories, yes.
But it's like, so a lot of these concepts that you're critiquing is like memory, and it's because it has a lot of cultural baggage, and it's very observer dependent. But aren't there new studies now about like people using machine learning to try to find categories which are independent of us? Can we just like do more studies on that, and then like just come to like know these categories? We might not have names for them, but slowly try to like figure out what they do and then get names for them?
Yes. Yeah, it's like I do agree in an ideal world, and that's kind of that kind of beautiful work in the modeling field, trying to find counterparts in the parameter space to our concept, that everyone is happy, right? Like I have a friend here in Leipzig who works on visual perception, object recognition. And I think he does something like that. So it's like also one of these models with thousands or even millions of parameters, and then somehow uses PCA or methods like that, dimension reduction methods, to find something that converges on a classical taxonomy. Yeah, and I think that would be, that's something I think what's close. Yeah, also for transformers and language comprehension. Yes, I think you're referring probably to that. I've seen something like that probably from Jean-Rémy King or Maria Toneva, one of these upcoming people. I think these people are very aware of that problem. Yeah, and they will find ways of dealing with that, I think. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, are there more questions?
One more question. Why is it an infinite complexity? Just because of the fact that these categories are so observer dependent, that we just add categories as we please? Is that why they're infinite?
Sorry, infinite?
Yeah, one of you said earlier, I don't know if you were just exaggerating, but you said there's an infinite amount of parameters.
Ach so. Or did I say that?
Yeah, maybe you just exaggerated, but
yeah, maybe I just exaggerated. No, I mean, of course, it's limited, but it's very high.
It's very high, so they are well defined.
You mean like? Sorry, I don't know what you're referring to.
Like when you were talking about, I don't know what the part was. I think it was about your language model. You talked about there being an infinite amount of variables, parameters, and I wonder if you mean by that just because of this fact that they're all like that we add these categories as we please, or if they're well defined by linguists, that these and these dependencies, these and these relationships exist. If these things are well defined, or if there is like an infinite more that you can always add.
Yes. No, that's true. Yes.
So which one of them is true?
There's an infinite number of theories that are compatible with anything. That's that's probably what I meant. So there's no way of like transcending that problem. I think that's the qualia problem, I guess. So like even when we now talk to each other, there's an infinite models and there's an infinite number of models in our minds, and probably everyone has a different model. But that's also something that I think people start to do, like to tackle individual data sets and finding that there's like electrophysiological data sets and finding that it's not the same model that fits each and every one of us.
Thank you very much. Also thoughts.
Hi. So I was wondering why you think, or why do you like argue that the oscillations come from the excitability of the neurons themselves, instead of, for example, the balance between excitation and inhibition or something like that?
Ach so, yeah, no, you're right. Of course, yes. It's the neuron can be dampened externally, or it can dampen itself. There's reciprocal connections, there's interneurons, etc. Yes. Yeah. No, sorry. I should probably change that in the slides, in particular for the slow type of oscillation that I'm working on. That's not like one cell who's like meandering between, you know, excitable, unexcitable. No, that's too easy. You're totally right. Yeah, it's like those slow frequencies can only be generated by larger compounds, probably even networks. Yeah, I haven't. Well, the basis for this is really coming from low-level perception studies. That's the main inspiration. So that's work by a guy called Peter Lakatos and Charles Schröder at NYU, and they have done ECOG in monkeys during low-level auditory perception tasks. So when the monkey is, I don't know, supposed to spot an auditory target or something like that. And there they draw that relationship between actual excitability at the cell and the behavior of the monkey. Yeah, so that's a science paper from 2008, I think. And it's been replicated with EEG, MEG in humans as well, in low-level auditory detection tasks. That's the main inspiration. But for the humans, we don't have the ECOG data. Now, for the humans, it looks differently. When you look into, there's a study by Nelson in 2007, and what they observed is rather something like an increase in high gamma that looks like a slow frequency oscillation. But if you have sufficient resolution in the measurement, then this just becomes like a spike train, essentially, that is modulated in amplitude over time. So it's like something like that. Yeah, in the EEG, we can see that. That's possible. No.
Thanks.
Okay. Thanks for this really interactive session. I think.
Thank you for the questions, guys. Thank you. 3:30. You were still so energetic. You didn't lie.
Yeah. Thank you, Lars, again. And so you offered that you also want to stay for a coffee break, if I got that right.
Sure, yeah.